In the forensics of modern cinema, there are films that capture a moment, and then there are films that act as a terminal diagnosis for a society. In 1991, John Singleton, a 23-year-old visionary, delivered Boyz and the Hood. It was a seismic event, a forensic deconstruction of what it meant to be young, black, and male in south-central Los Angeles. Singleton didn't just write a script, he wrote a mirror. He looked at the statistics of 1,990 a year, where Los Angeles saw nearly 1,000 homicides, many concentrated in the dead zones of the inner city, and he gave those numbers, faces, names, and pulses. The film was a warning, a desperate plea for the survival of a generation. But the investigation into the lives of the cast members reveals a chilling structural irony. While the film became a multi-million-dollar success and earned Singleton historic Oscar nominations, the prophecy of the streets did not stop at the edge of the lens. For three young actors in that cast, Lexie Bigham, Diedrich Dee Goldberg, and Lloyd Avery, the film wasn't an escape route. It was a prologue. To understand the tragedy, we must first analyze the environment. South Central in the early 90 seconds was a landscape defined by forensic neglect. The structural abandonment of the post-industrial era had left a vacuum that was filled by the crack cocaine epidemic and the hyper-militarized policing of the LAPD. Young black men were viewed as biological threats rather than citizens. John Singleton sought to disrupt this narrative by casting people who lived the reality they were portraying. He didn't want actors, he wanted truth-tellers. Lexie Bigham, who played Mad Dog, brought a specific kind of forensic honesty to the screen. In a pivotal scene, he returns a football to a group of children, a small gesture of humanity in a world of hardness. Lexie was a student of the craft, a Chicago-born actor who believed that if you could reflect the soul of the hood, you could somehow heal it. He saw the film as a chance to prove that even in a war zone, there is a capacity for gentleness. Diedrich Dee Goldberg, who played the iconic character Dookie, was the raw energy of the streets made flesh. He didn't need to audition with a monologue. His presence was the monologue. He walked into the room with the charisma of a neighborhood king, carrying a pacifier that symbolized a stolen childhood. Singleton recognized him as the real thing, a forensic sample of a culture that was both vibrant and volatile. Then there was Lloyd Avery II. In the most haunting forensic data point of the film, Lloyd played Knucklehead, the rival gang member who bobs out of a car window and pulls the trigger that ends the life of Ricky. It is the moment that breaks the heart of the audience. Lloyd was a paradox, a middle-class kid from the safe enclave of View Park who went to Beverly Hills High School. Yet, he was drawn to the edge. He possessed a forensic fascination with the life he portrayed, an attraction to the gravity of the streets that would eventually pull him out of the light and into the darkness. The film opened across America to packed theaters and stunned silence. It was hailed as the birth of a new black cinema. But as the flashbulbs of the red carpets faded, the three young men returned to a world that hadn't changed. The forensics of their lives show that while Hollywood could profit from their pain, it could not protect them from it. They were the children of the prophecy, young men who stood in front of a camera to show the world how people die in the hood, never suspecting that the world was taking notes. The investigation into their descent begins now, not in the fiction of the script, but in the cold, hard reality of the Los Angeles asphalt. In the study of sociology, there is a concept known as geographic destiny. It suggests that the coordinates of your birth often dictate the trajectory of your life. However, the forensics of the Boyz and the Hood cast show that destiny is rarely a straight line. For Lexie Bigham, Dee Goldberg, and Lloyd Avery II, the road to South Central was paved with vastly different intentions, yet they all arrived at the same intersection of fame and fragility. Lexie Bigham, Jr. was the old soul. Born in Chicago on the 4th of August 1968, Lexie was a product of the South Side, a place that requires a specific kind of mental toughness to survive. But Lexie wasn't interested in the street life. The forensics of his early years show a young man obsessed with the mechanics of empathy. After a stint at Southern Illinois University, he made a calculated professional move to Pasadena to study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. This wasn't a street kid wandering onto a set. Lexie was a trained technician. He performed in the classics, A Raisin in the Sun, Women Behind Bars, learning how to dissect a character from the inside out. When he arrived on the set of Boyz and the Hood, he brought a level of academic discipline that balanced the raw energy of the production. He was the man who understood that even Mad Dog, a gang member, needed a backstory of stolen innocence. To Lexie, acting was a bridge out of the struggle. Diedrich Dee Goldberg, conversely, was the natural. Born in Louisiana in 1971 and raised in the rhythm of the neighborhood, Dee didn't have a background in Shakespeare or Stanislavski. He had the streets. The investigation into his casting reveals that John Singleton didn't value Dee for his range, but for his authenticity. In the forensic landscape of film casting, Dee was a found object. He possessed a charisma that was unrefined and magnetic. He was Dookie, the kid with the J-hairy curl and the pacifier. The pacifier was a genius forensic touch, a visual shorthand for a generation of young men who were still children at heart while being forced to carry the burdens of soldiers. Dee lived the life he portrayed. He didn't have to find the character, he just had to be seen. For Dee, the film wasn't a craft, it was a confirmation of his existence. Then there was the most complex forensic profile, Lloyd Avery II. Born in 1969, Lloyd was the outlier. Unlike the characters in the film, Lloyd grew up in View Park, an affluent black neighborhood often referred to as the Black Beverly Hills. His father was a successful businessman. His world was one of safety, education, and opportunity. He attended Beverly Hills High School, the same halls walked by the children of the Hollywood elite. The investigation into Lloyd's psyche reveals a strange, dark fascination with the other side. While his peers were looking toward corporate success or Ivy League futures, Lloyd was drawn to the grit. He was an artist, a painter, and a deep thinker who seemed to feel a forensic imposter syndrome regarding his middle-class upbringing. He wanted to touch the reality of the struggle. When he auditioned for Singleton, he was cast as the knucklehead, the one who pulls the trigger. The structural tragedy of Lloyd Avery is that he spent his life trying to bridge the gap between his comfortable reality and his cinematic fiction. He didn't just want to play the role, he wanted the credibility that came with it. The forensics of his life show a man who was searching for a truth he didn't realize would eventually consume him. 3 men. 3 distinct origins. 1 Chicago scholar, 1 Louisiana natural, and 1 Beverly Hills dreamer. They were all walking toward a bright light, believing they had found a way to speak for the voiceless. But as the investigation continues, we see that the roles they played, the gang member, the neighborhood observer, the killer, were not just masks. In the high-pressure environment of 1,990 seconds, Los Angeles, those masks began to fuse to their faces, blurring the line between the action of the director and the reaction of the streets. In the forensics of cultural history, some events act as a hard reset for the national consciousness. The release of Boyz and the Hood in July 1991 was one such event. For decades, Hollywood had viewed the inner city through a lens of caricature or blaxploitation. But John Singleton provided a forensic gaze that was unflinching. He didn't just show the violence, he showed the causality. He showed the absence of fathers, the structural decay of the schools, and the constant, vibrating hum of police helicopters that acted as the soundtrack to a stolen childhood. The investigation into the film's reception reveals a profound split in the American psyche. While critics praised the verisimilitude of the performances, the young men on screen were experiencing something more visceral: validation. For Lexie Bigham, the Chicago-trained actor, the film's success meant that his academic approach to the streets was working. He was no longer just an actor in a play, he was a voice for a movement. He was invited to university panels and theater workshops. For a brief moment, the forensics of his career suggested he was on the path to becoming a permanent fixture in American drama. Diedrich Dee Goldberg became a neighborhood icon. The investigation into his life post-release shows that he became the face of the film for the people of Crenshaw. He wasn't just Dookie on screen, he was Dookie in the grocery store, at the gas station, and on the street corner. He embraced it with a restless, joyful energy. He told reporters that he felt like he was standing inside a dream. When he was cast in Poetic Justice, 1993, alongside Tupac Shakur and Janet Jackson, the forensic data of his trajectory pointed toward superstardom. He was the bridge between the block and the red carpet. However, the most critical forensic site of the film is the alleyway scene. This is where Lloyd Avery II, as the knucklehead, leans out of a car window with a double-barrel shotgun. The forensics of that scene are chillingly precise. Singleton shot it with a raw, handheld urgency. When Lloyd pulls the trigger, killing the character Ricky, played by Morris Chestnut, it wasn't just a plot point. It was a trauma that resonated through the theater. The investigation into Lloyd Avery's mindset after this scene is where the prophecy begins to take hold. Lloyd was praised for the cold, detached intensity of his performance. But for a kid from the safe streets of View Park, the praise felt like a demand for authenticity. The forensics of his life show a man who began to carry the weight of that fictional murder into his reality. He didn't want to be a Beverly Hills kid playing a killer. He wanted the streets to respect him as the man they saw on the screen. The success of Boyz n the Hood earned John Singleton 2 Oscar nominations, making him the youngest and first black person ever nominated for Best Director. It was a victory for black art, but the forensics of the industry show that the truth was becoming a commodity. The film was a warning to increase the peace, but the market was demanding more war. As the summer of 1991 faded into the fall, the three young men stood at the summit. They were famous, they were gifted, and they were in demand. But the investigation shows that they were also walking on a forensic fault line. The line between the action of the set and the reaction of the Los Angeles streets was beginning to erode. They had shown the world how to die in the hood. Now, the world was waiting to see if they knew how to live. The light was bright, but as we move into the next phase of the investigation, we see that the shadows were already beginning to lengthen. In the forensics of a failing social ecosystem, there is a phenomenon known as precursor anomalies, early, violent disruptions that signal a total structural failure of the safeguarding mechanisms around a population. For the cast of Boyz n the Hood, these anomalies manifested in the mid-1990s, through the sudden, brutal removal of two of its most visceral performers from the biological record. The investigation into the lives of Diedrich Dee Goldberg and Lexie Bigham Jr. reveals a haunting forensic duality. One man was reclaimed by the volatile, high-friction environment the film attempted to critique, while the other was stolen by a clinical, mechanical twist of fate that proved even the most disciplined survivor remains a subject to the laws of entropy. Diedrich Dee Goldberg was the first forensic casualty of the prophecy. By late 1994, at just 22 years of age, Dee existed in a state of high-velocity atmospheric friction. Despite his cinematic immersion in poetic justice alongside cultural icons like Tupac Shakur, his daily reality remained fundamentally tethered to the gravitational pull of the Los Angeles asphalt. The investigation into his final hours focuses on a November night defined by the subculture of illegal street racing, a high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled microeconomy where social status was measured in raw horsepower and a total disregard for the structural laws of public safety. The forensic reconstruction of the crime scene reveals that after a race, a verbal altercation escalated with lethal, military-grade efficiency. In the hyper-masculine, hyper-vigilant landscape of 1990 seconds, South Central, disputes were rarely resolved through diplomatic dialogue. Witnesses described a chaotic intersection where gang affiliations, personal egos, and the authenticity trap collided under the amber, flickering glow of streetlights. Gunfire erupted, and Dee Goldberg, the man the world recognized as Dookie, the silent observer with the pacifier, was caught in a ballistic crossfire that offered no exit strategy. He expired before professional medical intervention could be staged. The forensic irony was staggering and cruel. The man who had played the observer of neighborhood trauma had become a lead data point in the LAPD's homicide statistics. One perpetrator was eventually sentenced to the maximum penalty, but the structural loss was absolute. A raw, Louisiana-born talent was silenced before he could ever truly decode the systemic forces that governed his existence. Image: a forensic ballistics trajectory chart illustrating the kill zone in a street-level confrontation, overlaid with a 1994 LAPD crime scene marker, number 0042. Just as the community began its forensic audit of Dee's loss, a second, equally devastating blow struck the production's legacy. Lexie Bigham Jr. had been the scholar warrior of the trio. He had maintained a rigorous, disciplined professional trajectory, distancing himself from the street-level chaos through academic study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. In December 1995, Lexie was 27, having just wrapped the comedy High School High. He was successfully transitioning away from the heavy forensic roles of the gang-affiliated and the disenfranchised, seeking a career defined by artistic range rather than environmental trauma. However, the forensics of Lexie's death are chillingly clinical and devoid of the street drama the industry had come to expect from his demographic. On a rain-slicked Los Angeles night, Lexie was navigating the city's treacherous, poorly drained infrastructure. The investigation records a night of atmospheric instability, creating a profound layer of hydroplaning risk that Lexie's vehicle could not overcome. Near a sharp, unforgiving curve, his car suffered a total loss of traction, a mechanical divorce from the road. The centrifugal impact was instant, violent, and catastrophic. There was no foul play, no rival gang, and no street beef. Just the cold, indifferent physics of a metal chassis spinning out of control. Image: a technical physics diagram illustrating centrifugal force and traction loss on a 15-degree rain-slicked curve, highlighting the specific point of impact of Lexie Bigham's vehicle. The investigation into these two deaths provides a grim forensic realization. Within 48 months of the film's theatrical release, two of its most visceral performers were returned to the earth. One was taken by the prophecy of the gun, a victim of the very environment Singleton's lens had warned against. The other was taken by the indifference of the universe, a victim of a mechanical accident that ignored his discipline and his dreams. While Hollywood was still patting itself on the back for the raw authenticity of Singleton's vision, the men who provided that authenticity were being erased in real time. This left only Lloyd Avery II as the final witness. But the investigation into Lloyd's psyche shows that he was not mourning his castmates. He was being radicalized by their absence. He began to view their deaths as a confirmation that the edge was the only place where a man could truly exist. The forensic stage was being set for a descent into a darkness so absolute it would eventually eclipse the film itself. The first wave had broken. The storm was now moving inland, and Lloyd Avery was walking straight into its eye. In the forensics of high-stakes performance, there is a catastrophic phenomenon known as identity transference, where the psychological immune system of the actor fails, allowing the character's pathology to colonize the individual's reality. For Lloyd Avery II, this was not a passive slide, but a proactive, forensic migration into the abyss. The investigation into Lloyd's life following the global success of Boyz and the Hood reveals a man suffering from a profound authenticity dysphoria. Despite his middle-class pedigree in View Park and his elite education at Beverly Hills High, Lloyd felt a systemic shame for his safety. He viewed his privilege as a forensic barrier to true artistic credibility. He didn't want to merely portray the knucklehead. He wanted to be the catalyst of the trauma he depicted. The forensics of his descent are documented in a series of radical environmental rejections. Lloyd abandoned the manicured lawns of his upbringing and relocated to the epicenter of Los Angeles gang geography, the jungle, Baldwin Village. This was a structural war zone, a fortress of low-slung apartment blocks controlled by the Black P. Stones. To cement this transition from actor to affiliate, Lloyd performed an act of permanent forensic branding. He tattooed the word jungle directly across his left eyebrow. It was a facial signature that signaled the total erasure of the Beverly Hills scholar. He was no longer playing a role. He was engineering a new, lethal identity. Image: a high-contrast forensic overlay comparing Lloyd Avery's professional headshot from 1991 with his 2001 booking photo, highlighting the jungle tattoo and the hardening of his facial architecture. The investigation into his criminal records shows a man whose life began to mirror the alleyway scene with haunting, ballistic precision. In July 1999, the forensics of Lloyd's life reached a terminal velocity. In Santa Barbara, a double homicide occurred. Annette Edwards and her companion were executed in a cold, street-level hit. The investigation eventually consolidated around Lloyd Avery II. The motive was a murky, toxic sediment of debt and street-level cred, but the ballistic results were absolute. Lloyd had moved from the cinematic double-barrel shotgun of Boyz and the Hood to a real-world firearm. In 2001, the View Park Kid was convicted of double murder and sentenced to life in prison. He was 31 years old. He had successfully completed his transformation. He had bypassed the exit signs of fame and arrived at the final structural destination Singleton had warned against, the hyper-violent, sensory-deprived environment of the California penal system. Image: a structural diagram of the Security Housing Unit, SHU, at Pelican Bay State Prison, illustrating the 8x 10-foot concrete dimensions of Lloyd Avery's final environment. Lloyd was processed into Pelican Bay State Prison, a forensic landscape designed for the worst of the worst. However, the investigation into his final years reveals one last, strange architectural shift in his psyche. Inside the concrete silence of the SHU, Lloyd appeared to perform a system restore. He returned to the Bible. He became a devout, evangelical presence within the prison, spending his hours in a frantic state of prayer and proselytization. He preached redemption to the unredeemable, attempting to use his remaining breath to reverse the knucklehead prophecy he had so meticulously fulfilled. But the structural mechanics of Pelican Bay are indifferent to spiritual pivots. Lloyd was assigned a cellmate, Kevin Roby, a man who functioned as a forensic antithesis to Lloyd's newfound light. Roby was a self-proclaimed Satanist, a man whose biological record was a testament to occult violence. On the night of the 6th of September 2005, the friction between these two ideologies reached a flashpoint. The forensic report from the following morning is a masterpiece of horror. Kevin Roby had attacked Lloyd, strangling him to death in the silence of their shared 80-square-foot tomb. But the act transcended simple homicide. Roby had used Lloyd's body as a sacrificial altar. He had drawn occult symbols in Lloyd's blood across the concrete floor and positioned the corpse in a ritualistic, pentagrammatic arrangement. The prophecy had reached its final, most grotesque form. The actor who wanted to be real had been consumed by a reality so dark that it defied the logic of the screen. Lloyd Avery II was 36 years old. The knucklehead had been silenced, not by the streets he worshipped, but by a ritualistic evil he never saw coming. In the forensics of the global entertainment superstructure, there exists a predatory phenomenon known as the authenticity harvest. This is a deliberate structural process, where the raw, unrefined environmental trauma of marginalized populations is commodified for cinematic prestige, yet the industry maintains a surgical, cold-blooded distance when that trauma inevitably transcends the boundaries of the celluloid. The investigation into the 3 decades following the release of Boyz and the Hood reveals a chilling, institutionalized silence. While the film is globally canonized, enshrined in the National Film Registry, and dissected in academic ivory towers, the names of Lexie Bigham, Diedrich Dee Goldberg, and Lloyd Avery II have been meticulously and systematically scrubbed from the industry's formal roll of honor. The forensics of this institutional erasure are profoundly revealing of Hollywood's internal value systems. When a mainstream, high-net-worth actor faces a crisis, the Hollywood infrastructure mobilizes with immediate, high-frequency public relations tributes, well-funded memorial foundations, and prestigious in memoriam segments at televised award galas. However, for Lexie, Dee, and Lloyd, no such structural monuments were ever authorized. The investigation suggests that their ends were deemed too authentic, a forensic liability for a Hollywood that prefers its social critiques to remain safely intellectualized and profitable. To formally acknowledge that Lexie Bigham died on the very rain-slicked Los Angeles streets, he tried to escape through the craft of acting, or to address the ritualistic, occult horror of Lloyd Avery's end in the sensory-deprived bowels of Pelican Bay, would be to admit a catastrophic failure of the industry's duty of care. It would be a confession that the industry recruited these young men for their lived experience, but offered zero psychological shielding or structural scaffolding for the high-pressure fallout of that exposure. The investigation from the director's chair provides a secondary, heartbreaking layer of forensic grief. John Singleton, the visionary architect who gave these men a global platform, remained a visceral witness to the deterioration of South Central even as he ascended into the stratosphere of the Hollywood elite. Singleton often described Dee Goldberg as a pure forensic sample of street energy, a man who didn't merely act, but projected the vibration of the block with a frequency that couldn't be faked. He was reportedly haunted by the psychological death spiral of Lloyd Avery, recognizing too late that the industry had opened a high-pressure valve in Lloyd's psyche without providing a forensic manual for its safe closure. In the predatory casting environment of 1,990 seconds Los Angeles, authenticity was a raw material to be exploited, not a vulnerability to be protected or nurtured. In April 2019, the forensic file on Boyz and the Hood reached a final, crushing milestone when John Singleton himself passed away at age 51. His death functioned as a structural wiping of the drives. He was the sole archivist of these young men's humanity, the only power player who insisted that Lexie, Dee, and Lloyd were not disposable cinematic assets, but the essential heartbeat of the American narrative. With Singleton's voice silenced, the Hollywood machine completed its pivot toward newer, more marketable, gritty content. The families of Bigham, Goldberg, and Avery were left to maintain their own makeshift memorials in the shadow of a city that had successfully commodified their images while systematically discarding their lives like set dressing. Ultimately, this forensic audit proves that Boyz and the Hood remains a structural open wound in the American psyche. The film captured a profound, vibrating truth in 1991, but the forensic aftermath of its cast demonstrates that the truth is a hazardous material that Hollywood rarely knows how to store safely. The industry demanded the authenticity of the Hood to win awards and sell tickets, but it refused to pay the consequences of the Hood when the credits finished rolling. The result is a legacy where the film continues to generate massive revenue and academic acclaim, while the three young men who bled for its realism remain ghosts in the digital static, unmarked, unmentioned, and unheard. In the final forensic accounting of Boyz and the Hood, we are left with a profound structural paradox. A cinematic masterpiece designed to increase the peace and offer a terminal warning to a generation became, through a series of atmospheric and psychological failures, the eternal resting place for three of its most visceral souls. The investigation into the lives of Lexie Bigham Jr., Diedrich Dee Goldberg, and Lloyd Avery II concludes not with a tidy resolution, but with a haunting, low-frequency resonance. They were never merely side characters in a 1991 blockbuster. They were the primary biological data points in a high-stakes experiment regarding the cost of radical honesty in American art. The forensics of their legacy are found in the raw humanity they left imprinted on the celluloid before the world reclaimed them. Lexie Bigham, through the quiet strength of Mad Dog, provided forensic proof that tenderness and a sense of old soul dignity could survive even within the most rigid war zones of South Central. His death remains a silent, clinical testament to the inherent fragility of the human condition, regardless of discipline or dream. Dee Goldberg, as Dookie, carried the vibrant, chaotic rhythm of the Louisiana dirt and the California street corner in his very breath, proving that laughter in a dark place is not a denial of reality, but a forensic act of defiance against it. Image, a high-resolution forensic composite of the three actors, their images fading into a golden, cinematic light, overlaid with the text, "More than a statistic." And then there is the inescapable forensic weight of Lloyd Avery II. His trajectory remains the most difficult for the system to process. A man who became a haunting symbol of how art can mutate into a lethal prophecy when the boundaries of identity are not structurally reinforced. His end in the ritualistic silence of Pelican Bay serves as a final, dark sermon on the dangers of seeking authenticity within the abyss. Lloyd didn't just inhabit a role. He allowed the role to perform a total hostile takeover of the man. Ultimately, this investigation proves that legacy is not measured by the trophies collected in a Hollywood ballroom, but by the truth frequency you leave behind when the world stops listening. More than 30 years later, the lost boys of Boyz and the Hood still live. They live every time a kid in a hard place watches the screen and feels seen. They live every time the film is paused to study a face that feels like a brother, a cousin, or a friend. They didn't get statues, but they earned something far more permanent: immortality in the static. Lexie, Dee, and Lloyd are no longer side characters in John Singleton's story. In the forensic history of the human heart, they are the lead protagonists. Their light was brief, intense, and unfiltered, and even after the system crashes and the industry falls silent, that light remains.